Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting this misty autumn country lane painting. I'll be showing you a sort of summary of the techniques that I use here. If you're interested in a more detailed two-part tutorial, then please take a look at my Patreon page. The link is in the description below, where there will be a very in-depth tutorial for this painting. I'm using Millford 100% cotton paper. It's cold pressed and it's 11 inches by 15 inches or 28 centimetres by 38 centimetres. It's taped to my board with ordinary decorators masking tape, and my board's at an angle of about 45 degrees, and I'm going to paint the sky in first, wet in wet. I'm using a large Ron Ranson Pro Art Harky brush, and I've wet the sky area. First of all, you saw that I just put in the indications of a few perspective lines for the country lane. I go into this in more detail on Patreon, but for now, let's get on with the sky. This is indigo, quite a weak mixture, and mixed with the water that's already on the page, I should get a really nice sort of graduated but almost flat wash to create a very pale misty sky with that lovely diffused light that you get when it's misty. You can see the paint just drifting down the page, and it will soften and dry really nice and transparent. This is a really rich mixture of tube consistency indigo and burnt umber with a bit of Payne's grey in it probably, and I'm just putting in shapes and impressions for my distant tree line. These colours look really dark to start with, but remember we're painting wet in wet and they will diffuse and soften back. This is burnt sienna, and this will give me my beautiful autumn tinge to the trees. The dark browns will give me my shadows. I'm trying to leave some gaps so that my suggested loose tree line looks more interesting, and so you can see the misty grey sky behind it. Then once I'm happy with my tree line, I'll just soften across the base with a brush, and then I'll sweep some of that paint across to create the edges of my country lane. This is using a small Pro Art Harky brush. I don't want to do too much there, just to indicate the sides of the road, and then to indicate a little bit of the sort of field below the trees. But we'll put in more of the foreground later. And just using the tips of a 3/4 inch flat brush to feather through and sort of flatten out the roadway and the land on either side of it. And now I've laid my board flat so that the paint won't run down the page anymore, and it should just settle nicely. But before it dries, I'm going to use the corner of a plastic card, and I'm going to etch through the rich paint and use this corner to scrape out some of my trees. So I'm lifting the paint out, scratching through the surface of the paper, and creating some nice loose trunks and branches. This was one of Ron Ranson's favourite techniques. In fact, a lot of loose painters use this and have used this technique to a sort of lesser or greater degree. It can make some really attractive and spontaneous marks that work really well and harmonise with the loose painting style. And this is pretty much the first layer done. I'm now going to leave the painting to dry completely. Once it's completely dry, I can come back and continue to paint the foreground. Now the foreground, it's not going to be very detailed, it's just going to be suggested with rich paint in the same colours as those that I've used before. And I'm just going to just put in some real scrappy marks across the foreground to indicate undergrowth and foliage and vegetation on either side of the country lane. I don't want the eye to get stuck here. I want the eye to move down the lane towards the gap that I've left between the trees where my focal point will be, which will be a couple of cottages just sort of disappearing into the mist and a little puff of smoke coming out of one of the chimneys to sort of indicate a nice, warm, comforting fire. So on both sides, I'm going to do the same, just putting in these rough marks, larger on the left and a smaller amount of vegetation on the right. I can use the card, the corner of a store card, to etch some grasses through, again to add texture, and I can sprinkle some salt into the damp paint, and that will give me even more texture as the salt pushes the paint away and will give me some sort of little textural marks once it dries. So now I will leave it all alone until it's completely dry. Now that it's dry, I've stood it back up at a 45-degree angle again on my board, and I'm going to use my 3/4 inch flat brush and my dirty paint water, maybe just a little bit of added indigo to it, and a little bit of brown if I need it, to create my the first distant cottage, the nearest one. I'm just using my flat brush to sweep in a very simple parallelogram which will represent my roof. And then all I'm going to do is indicate chimneys, a few little windows, and then a larger cottage where I'll put that just a little bit of a roof showing behind that smaller cottage, again with a chimney. So I'm just really suggesting these with a few marks. Hopefully the brain will see these marks that I'm making and interpret them as cottages disappearing around the corner of the lane in the mist. The paler paint that I'm using to give the illusion of these cottages also helps to make them look more distant. By following the lines of perspective and putting the cottages sort of at the vanishing point and painting with pale paint, I'm creating aerial perspective and depth and distance. I can then take my small calligraphy brush and I can just carefully touch in a few darks just to strengthen up the windows and the chimneys. Because I'm going to be putting in a little puff of smoke coming out of one of the chimneys, I do want them to be reasonably defined. I've put a bit more indigo into that pale mixture, and I'm now using a small round synthetic brush to sweep some slightly darker grey lines into the roadway just to finish that off. And then I'll use exactly the same colour but on my large Harkey brush and sweep it across the foreground for some dry brush, which should just give me a nice sort of finishing touch of sort of shadow and texture across the front of the road and just frame off the painting across the foreground. And then a few touches of dark underneath the tree line, just to sort of balance up the tonal values a bit. And the painting's nearly done. All I need to do now is show you, there's two methods that I'm going to show you for creating smoke from the chimneys. The first method works better on a darker sky, but I'll show you anyway. It's using a stiff bristle brush dipped in clean water and sort of scrubbing at the sky just above the chimney pot to create the smoke. What I do is leave the wet area wet for a few seconds, then dab off with a tissue. You can see it's lifting off some smoke areas. That would look better against a slightly darker sky. So what I'm going to do in this case is use a soft brush, some slightly darker grey, and carefully put in just a little cloud of smoke coming out from the chimney. My painting is quite serene, quite quiet. It's sort of that silence that you get on a really misty day. So I want to emphasise that. So I'm not having my smoke coming up at a steep angle as if it's windswept. It's rising almost vertically from the chimney pot, just a very slight lean, and I think that creates a really nice focal point. So I think this painting is just about finished. You could of course put a couple of figures in the lane if you prefer, but here it is. I've removed the tape and put it against a white background, and you can see it with fresh eyes as if it was in a frame almost, and I think it works quite nicely. I'm quite pleased with the effects of the loose brushwork. The brushwork really is as minimal as possible. I've tried to get away with as fewer brush strokes as I can to create a sort of maximum visual effects, if you see what I mean. I think that's the sort of part of the trick of loose watercolour painting, is to suggest as much as you can with the smallest amount of brushwork. And it's not as easy as it looks to do, but it can take a bit of practice and it can be a very satisfying way of painting. So I hope you'll give it a go. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I love reading your comments, even if I sometimes don't get time to answer to all of them, as the channel has grown so much. Well, thanks so much for your support in watching here on YouTube. If you enjoyed it, please click on the thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, because that really helps with my reach, and click on the bell icon if you want to be notified when I post, which is usually at least twice a week. And thank you so much to my wonderful Patreon group who support this channel. I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.